Hey, everybody, this is Ben Bowman. Welcome back to another episode of The Oregon Bridge.
I think that, we had a lot of important races. I think that the voters who are interested did turn out, but I think you have a lot of people who are really frustrated with politics right now. And so you're kind of seeing that with obviously the low non-affiliated turnout. I don't think that the political environment is ripe for independents and people who don't have a party base behind them to win. I think it's just difficult, and it's already so rare, and it became more rare in the last 10 years of partisan divide as that partisan divide has gotten tougher to bridge.
All right, folks. Alex Titus is out of the country right now. He clearly is not prioritizing the podcast in his life, but we have a suitable replacement, Reagan Knopp. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Ben. I think that Alex is attempting to prove that he's the most conservative by breaking through Biden's southern border protection to prove that it won't work. And so we wish Alex the best on that and proving himself to be the best Republican in the state here.
Best of luck to Alex in his journey. Okay, so today's episode, Reagan and I are both political nerds, and we have been poring over election data, reading Twitter, reading the reporting on what has happened. And so what we're going to try to do today is basically provide some high point takeaways, not just of what happened in the election, but the implications of what happens. What does it mean moving forward? What does it teach us about Oregon politics or national politics? And then we'll walk through 5 or 6 of the top flight races.
I think the first thing that we need to talk about is with Oregon's system, and this was true, by the way, before postmarks counted, but postmarks count for the first election in Oregon. That was a bill passed by the legislature. I think it was last year or the short session earlier this year. And so we have postmarks, which means if your ballot was picked up by the Postal Service or dropped off directly at your UPS location, it was postmarked by election day, then it counts. And I think that the USPS has worked pretty well with the local clerks to make sure that those ballots are moved are expedited to the local clerks so they get counted quickly. But those can come in up to like 7 days after the election. And then also we've always had this situation with vote by mail, where if you drop your ballot in the county you don't live in, those counties work to exchange the ballots and move them. And so that takes another couple of days. And so we usually have really good results on election night, and we did, except for one county, which we'll talk about real briefly. But it's going to take a couple of days to shake out close races. And so if we say anything here, we're kind of working with the information we have on the Thursday after election day in the afternoon. And there will probably be another update. Most of the counties are updating every evening after the election for 3 or 4 days, and then every week until certification in June. So that's just at the top. It's really important for everyone to know that not all these results are final, but a lot of them are decided. There just isn't enough ballots to change the outcome.
So while we're on this, have you been tracking the Clackamas County situation? And can you give a brief overview of what the hell is going on with the Clackamas County
little
elections?
Bit. So it seems like a few days before the election, election officials and the county clerk, Sherry Hall, in Clackamas County, realized that the printing of their ballots, so the printing of the ballots doesn't happen at the county, it's outsourced. And the company that printed the ballots, unfortunately, either misprinted or printed,
smudged the barcodes.
Yeah. And Oregon law requires you to attempt to run them through the barcode machine, I believe. And so every ballot needs to go through that barcode machine, and they have to, if they don't make it through that machine, they have to be copied to another ballot that is a fresh ballot that has a working barcode, and that has to be done by a volunteer from each political party, and then it has to be checked. And they had an emergency meeting yesterday morning at the Clackamas County Commission, got an update, and it seems like a couple things are happening. One, this duplication process, we don't know exactly how many ballots it takes place on, but it's taking place on a lot more ballots than it would normally. You have a few of these messed up ballots, or someone who spills their coffee on their barcode, right? So they've always had this process in place, but they've never had to use it on this many ballots before. Thousands upon thousands, probably, ballots. They said it took them about 6 hours to complete 144 ballots. And so the county administrator, and remember that the Clackamas County funds the clerk, but the clerk is separately elected. So they have to work together on this stuff. The county doesn't tell them what to do and vice versa. And they're still following all the guidelines. And so they can't open ballots and not in view of the public, or that is being recorded by a camera where the public can view. And so they're still working within the space that they have. But the county administrator said he's committing 200 county employees on shifts until all of these ballots get counted. And so it seems like that they're moving to address the situation as much as they can, but it's obviously not an ideal scenario for a lot of reasons.
The Oregonian, just before we started recording today, again, this is Thursday, May 19th. Headline is Clackamas County ballot counting could stretch to mid-June, unapologetic county elections head says. So the politics of this is really interesting. And the lead of the story is the massive delay in tabulating election results for Oregon's third largest county could continue until mid-June. The politics here are the Secretary of State, a Democrat, Shemia Fagan, basically called out Sherry Hall. And then Tootie Smith, the Republican chair of the Clackamas County Commission, also to the press kind of called out Sherry Hall. Sherry Hall is no stranger. She's the clerk. She's no stranger to controversy when it comes to elections related issues. But to Reagan's point, the reason why this matters, there's like 2 or 3 state legislative races that we will not be able to call for weeks. It's unlikely that we'll be able to officially call the Schrader-Jamie McLeod-Skinner race for weeks. Reagan, are you hearing anyone suggest that the Lori Chavez-DeRemer Jimmy Crumpacker race is meaningfully impacted by this, or do they assume Lori's far enough ahead?
No, I think Lori's far enough ahead. The Oregonian went ahead and called that race, but they haven't called Schrader's race, and so I think that's the way it will stay. And I think the main reason for that is because Lori's ahead and her base is in Clackamas. She was elected in Clackamas and is running Clackamas before. So in all likelihood, she's going to benefit from those votes, not lose votes. Whereas Jamie's ahead, but her base is not in Clackamas, as Schrader's is. And so he's more likely to surge from that. I think a lot of people are looking at those numbers and saying that Schrader probably won't take the lead, but he could close the gap pretty significantly with that. So, and I think that's why. So Lori would benefit and she's ahead. Schrader would benefit, but he's behind. And so that's the difference, I think, there.
So we jumped the gun a little bit by going into races. Before we dive into specific races, let's talk about high point takeaways from the 2022 primary elections. So the first one I want to introduce for listeners, a bit of it's not a controversy, but differing takes on Twitter about turnout. So the reporting going up to election day was like, holy cow, the turnout is so low. This could be a record low turnout. Aaron Mesh from Willamette Week said, so much for voter malaise. The absolute number of ballots Oregon election officials have received so far, which when he tweeted was 978,000, is 75,000 more votes than have ever been cast in a midterm primary. Representative Julie Fahey, the Democratic Majority Leader, then tweeted, as of 6 p.m., this was yesterday, we're now up to 999,000 ballots accepted. So far, that's a 10% increase in primary votes cast from 18 to 22. And then she goes on to predict that turnout as a percent of estimated eligible voters in Oregon, not as a percent of registered, will be higher in 22 than any recent midterm. John Horvick, friend of the pod, had a differing take. He basically said he's basically looking at as a percent, he's looking at turnout as a percent of registered voters, which is obviously higher this cycle and gets higher every cycle because of motor voter, automatic voter reg, etc. He basically says turnout among Dems is 45%, 47% among Republicans, which is average. For NAVs, it's just 13%, which is 3 points below the record low. With open races for the Democratic and Republican nomination for governor and open races for congressional districts and contested primary and a third one, blah, 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 blah. He says, all in all, turnout looked disappointing to me. So Reagan, where do you fall? Disappointing turnout or impressive turnout?
To me, it doesn't really matter a whole lot. I mean, I think I'd probably more likely to take Horvick's side because it's pretty, I think Fahey's probably right that if you measured as a percentage of eligible voters, it'll be higher, obviously, than registered. But was that the difference that she was talking about, or was she? But we've rarely ever measured Oregon election turnout that way. That's kind of maybe a new way to measure that might be better, but is kind of seems a little more convenient for her point. But ultimately, I don't think it matters. I think that, we had a lot of important races. I think that the voters who are interested did turn out, but I think you have a lot of people who are really frustrated with politics right now. And so you're kind of seeing that with obviously the low non-affiliated turnout. And I think, look, it's just a policy choice. If your policy is you want to send a ballot to everyone, which is basically what Motor Voter does, right? If you have any contact with major government entities, a DMV specifically, you're going to end up getting a ballot unless you really say you don't want it. That's fine, but like you just expect lower voter turnout. And so if you want to be great at high turnout, then just let everyone register online in less than 5 minutes like we used to. But if you really do want to send everyone a ballot, go for it. It's just expect low turnout and don't have a problem with the turnout being low. That's my take on it, which I think is not everyone's favorite partisan talking point, but I think it's just reality.
So the next high point that for me, so I was looking at races where I thought the candidate overperformed what I was expecting to happen there. Not that they won and I didn't expect them to win, but their margin or total number of votes was higher than I anticipated. Here are people who did better than I thought they would. Speaker Tina Kotek, Representative Andrea Salinas, Christina Stevenson for BOLI, Jamie McLeod-Skinner in CD5, Val Hoyle in CD4. All of those individuals are Democratic women. So I think one takeaway for me is that Democratic women overperformed expectations. There's a couple of cases where that wasn't true. And then the other takeaway, someone tweeted this, I can't remember who. It is very plausible that the number of women in Congress from Oregon is going to triple at the end of this election cycle, with Bonamici being joined by Val Hoyle and Andrea Salinas, depending on the outcomes of those races. I have no idea if
and you will have a woman elected from CD5 too. If Jamie McLeod-Skinner pulls off hers, you'll have 2 women in those races. So Republican or Democrat, it won't matter. You'll still have another woman added to the list.
That's right. I didn't even think about that because Crumpacker is out. So no matter what, there will at least be 2 women. Mm-hmm. And then Hoyle is up against Skarlatos and Salinas up against Mike Erickson, which we'll get to in a minute. And then this one, I'm curious your thoughts on. So going into this, there was polling. I think DHM had some polling that basically said, like, would you prefer an outsider or someone with experience? And everyone wanted an outsider. And like people have been assuming this cycle that there'd be this anti-incumbent sentiment. And up and down the ballot, I was trying to find. So in terms of incumbents who lost, Brad Witt, who it's very generous to call him an incumbent considering his new district is miles and miles away. It's half a state away from his old district. Yeah. Kurt Schrader, who again, half of his district is brand new. Aside from that, like, Dan Ryan wins easily. Joanne Hardesty overperforms what I think people expected from her. Lynn Peterson at Metro, people thought might be in trouble. She's above 50% right now, although we don't know what's happening with Clackamas County. So what do you make of those outcomes, this anti-incumbency sentiment versus the results of the election?
Well, there's one more race that I was watching, and that was Lane County. And Lane County is a blue county. And if you tabulate all the votes countywide, very blue county, but their commission system is only 5 and it's district based, which means that not all of those districts are bright blue. Some of them are red, some of them are competitive. And the county commission has been controlled by both Democrats and Republicans over the past 20 years. One incumbent did lose, Joe Burney. Now he was on his first term in there, and there's late ballots. It's only 150 votes separating them, so that could flip. But I don't remember where I read this, if it was Willamette Week or the Oregonian. One of them said that early ballots used to lean Republican, and that hasn't been true in the past. Every year I've worked in politics, and especially last year, late ballots almost all favored Republicans as they were tabulating. All those races in the legislature that were close tightened when the Republican was behind. And when the Republican was ahead, their lead extended. You think about Denise Bowles' race, you think about Jeff Helfrich's race. Both of those races tightened significantly the day or two as counting continued and those late ballots trickled in. So my feeling is that late ballots still are going to lean a little bit more Republican. They're more likely to hold their ballot. My potential pushback on that is, so Kitzhaber 2010, this was a race I worked on as an intern. So Kitzhaber was down substantially on election night, and
it took, I think, several days, but eventually he won because there was all these late votes counted in from Multnomah County and Washington County.
Yeah, I mean, that's Multnomah though. Like,
but so
there aren't enough Republicans for that to be a late Republican deciding race. I would say most other counties, most other competitive counties, Republicans hold their ballots longer. That's been my experience.
I agree. I think that's probably true, but the question will be, in 2020, there was virtually no field campaign efforts from most campaigns, which the Kitzhaber late turnout in 2010, I think, was driven largely by literally thousands of volunteers going door to door, collecting ballots, reminding people to turn them in, et cetera, et cetera. So I wonder if 2022 we'll see. And there's something that should be stated. It is easier for Democrats to do turnout field work than Republicans because Democratic voters tend to be more compact. They tend to live.
That's a great point.
So it'll be interesting to see if how the late ballot returns from Republicans meets the ability of Democrats to do more turnout going door to door in the 2022 general.
Yeah. Well, and I've always acknowledged, I think that the unions do a really good job in terms of, they really put a lot of effort into making sure the voters that respond to their messages do turn out. And so I think that they have, I think that they've made sure to keep their union members involved in politics. And so I think they have high participation rates on that, which means they've got a lot of boots on the ground. And it can be hard for Republicans to match that level. And they've been doing it a long time. And again, I acknowledge they're really good at it. So I think that's also a big piece.
Before we jump into some specific races, I think probably the most important conversation that needs to be had about what just happened in Oregon is a conversation about money in politics. Because there's a lot of people with a lot of different views on money in politics who feel validated by what happened on Tuesday night. So my initial thought, and this is not novel, is the amount of millions of dollars spent by people who really never had much of a chance of winning. I mean, the obvious example is Carrick Flynn with the 15 million. I don't think it's fair to say that he never had a chance of winning. I think he certainly could have won if things went differently. Cody Reynolds is 2 million. I think probably was destined to always fail. Hundreds of thousands of dollars spent by GOP candidates for governor who didn't even crack 10%. Hundreds of thousands of dollars spent by challengers to Val Hoyle who got 65%. Hundreds of thousands of dollars spent in city of Portland races where, I think Vadim Mazursky is in third place right now. And they probably cracked $1 million total with him in the independent expenditures. So I think this is probably always true to some degree, but in this cycle, it seemed especially pronounced, like the amount of money spent, even in places where just really no one thought it was going to come together. So that's one of the things I'm thinking about with money. Reagan, what's your takeaway given all the money that was spent? What did it mean?
Well, in the landmark and totally correct Citizens United decision, the Supreme Court said totally that speech and money are closely correlated, and the fact that your ability to spend money to say things is related to your speech and very closely related, if not exactly the same, right?
Yeah, and rich people should be able to speak more than poor people, right, Reagan?
Yes, absolutely. Saying. That's totally what I think. No, but my reason for bringing that up is I kind of think that a lot of the reason that Democrats, some Democrats, not all Democrats, say that we should limit campaign finances and the ability to give money in these races is because Phil Knight can write $1 million check, right? And has, except for Phil Knight has written a lot of $1 million checks that haven't made an impact in the sense that, New Buehler was fully funded, but it still lost by 7 points, right? And except for Kitzhaber in 2014, Phil Knight has not backed a winner in the governor's race, right? And so you're saying, okay, well, he can write $1 million check, but what is that buying him? And the same thing with Flynn. He's backed by an out-of-state billionaire, and maybe Oregon is unique because I've seen people say our voters pamphlet basically makes it so that you can't buy an election because everyone has the information in front of them and they have weeks to make the decision. And so you can't have an out-of-state billionaire coming in by a congressional race. Now, obviously, Salinas got some out-of-state money herself, a little bit, $1 million from a DC PAC that backs Latino and Latina candidates, right? But I think that what we kind of saw was it's like maybe Oregon is unique, but I kind of don't think so. I think that just like the money and the politics isn't buying that as many votes as it purports to. It still has to be backed by good messaging and a good candidate and a
Yes.
ground game. And so, like, yeah, I guess limiting money in politics might fix some of the issues, but I've always been more on the transparency side. Let people spend what they want. Burn cash, as you were talking about, candidates who spent money who really maybe had no business doing so, right? So I think that like if campaign finance reform doesn't happen, it's not like Oregon is going to turn red because Phil Knight writes a $10 million check. Like there's going to have to be work put in with that, and Republicans are going to have to make an actual, have to make their arguments as we've always attempted to, right? So that's my view on it.
I think that's actually that's really well said, and I agree with that. I disagree with you on Citizens United, as you might expect, but I think this election cycle definitely proves that money matters. Certainly, money is a really important factor. In fact, maybe one of the most important factors, but it is certainly not enough to overpower. Like let's look at. I mean, we'll come to CD6 in a second, but CD6 is the most exaggerated one. Carrick Flynn has a total of 15 or 16 million spent either by him or for him. Salinas probably less than 5 million, maybe less than 4.
Yeah.
But her endorsements were incredibly strong. To your point, she was supported by labor groups and other groups who had people on the ground volunteering for her. She had Democratic Party volunteers supporting her. She had elected experience, a really strong voters pamphlet statement. Like all of those things not only beat out the money, but like beat it out substantially. One real quick non-specific race highlight that I wanted to make sure listeners were aware of, and we should maybe we should talk about this at length with a guest at some point. But headline from Oregon School Boards Association newsletter: election environment proves tough for school district bonds. So rural districts across the state said no to school bonds, which always makes me like genuinely feel very sad. Because these districts tend to have far worse facilities than Portland metro districts. I'm talking about Morrow County voted down a school bond, Crook County voted down a school bond, South Umpqua voted down a school bond, Days Creek voted down a school bond, North Bend, Roseburg, Gervais, Lebanon, rough. The people who did pass were the bigger. Beaverton passed one, Corvallis passed one, Dallas passed one, LeGrand passed one. And Amity, I guess, is still too close to call. But I don't have an answer for this. But it is not fair that kids growing up in rural parts of the state don't get the same kind of facilities and amenities that kids from more suburban and urban parts of the state get. And we should figure out how to fix that, because it makes me really sad to think about.
I was talking to a Republican I know in one of those rural districts, and they basically said that in their area there was not the best effort from that local school board and from that district in terms of explaining what the bond was. And I talked to somebody else who said that I think voters, a lot of these rural bonds, because they know that their voters are less interested in maybe paying the big bucks for, or paying large taxes, or seeing large tax hikes, or even investing hundreds of millions in education. They scaled back their plans and are just using it to do like significant maintenance and small renovations, and actually said that might have a negative impact actually and make it worse, because people actually want to buy something significant and tangible instead of just general upkeep. And so like Albany passed a school bond recently, but it included a complete overhaul of the new of the West Albany High School, which is a pretty well-known high school throughout the state. And there's a ton of people that I know that aren't even living in Albany or didn't for very long. They all went to West Albany High School, right? And then we built a couple of new schools with that. And so people want to feel like they're actually getting something with their money. And so I think, maybe these rural districts need to pick a large project that they can rally the community behind, and then stuff all of the other stuff in with their bond measure. I don't know. But I also think that there's a lot of anger with the traditional school system in conservative communities right now for a lot of reasons, right? And we won't go into the merit of those, but you think about the obviously the discussions about critical race theory and racism and how it's taught in schools. A lot of the, obviously in the governor's race, that the tampons being distributed in all bathrooms became an issue towards the end, right? There's just a lot of this stuff where I think people are frustrated because their values don't align with the school system, because the school system is a lot of it is directed by what happens at the state level, not at the local level, even though they do have their local school boards where they can make some changes. They can't make all the changes, and a lot of the policy is still dictated by the state.
I genuinely feel like that. I agree that that is a perception that is very real among voters, particularly in rural parts of the state. But the idea that there's critical race theory being taught in Morrow County School District or Days Creek School District is bananas. That is just not happening. But the media environment is, I think, does make people feel like that is true, even if it isn't. I will plug, there's a state program. It's basically a bond matching grant program where the state will match a certain amount of local bond dollars passed by communities. And that has been a big help in helping some, more traditionally conservative communities get bonds over the hump, but it's not enough to, like, I think anyone would look at the map of where bonds are passing and where they're not and see that there's inequity in the system. So anyway, let's talk about the political races. We'll start with the obvious starting point, which is the governor's race. Yep. It's still early to be trying to interpret too much, but my main takeaway on the Democratic side is very commanding win for Tina Kotek. Like, I think even Kotek's people were probably surprised by the margin. There was this reporting from Willamette Week that said they sent out. Do you see this?
That's what I was going to say. Yes, I was just this memo that was distributed by the campaign either that morning or Monday morning that basically said that turnout suggests that Read is going to be ahead early, or it's going to be really close early, but that they're still expecting to win. It says that she overcame a fundraising challenge, getting outraised early on, and that Treasurer Read had won 2 statewide elections while she had not. And so there was a lot of downplaying of the expectations and trying to lower that bar a little bit for her. And then she ended up surging right past it. And I think that it's pretty clear that the electorate, the Democratic electorate, from my sense, is pretty progressive in Oregon at this point. Like the moderate and the progressive split is bigger than it's been, I think, in a long time. And it's not true in every race and for every candidate. But overall, the Democratic Party in Oregon is pretty progressive at this point. You see that with them moving on from Schrader.
And it's interesting because, like, on the national level, the progressive wing of the party is like not the establishment. The progressive wing of the party is like outside the establishment, and they almost have an adversarial relationship. Tina Kotek is very much the Democratic Party leadership in Oregon, right? She was speaker for 10 years and she's a very progressive person. So really interesting political dynamic. But yeah, it's not like at the national level where, like, Tina Kotek is like Bernie Sanders or AOC and running from outside of the party. She was broad. Like, this is a case where I think we talked about this before. Like, my faith in powerful endorsements helping people win elections has been affirmed by a lot of these outcomes, because this was another race where Kotek, really just dominated on the endorsement side, from everything from pro-choice Oregon to Planned Parenthood to labor unions to the conservation voters. Tobias Read was able to get 2 former governors and some legislators, but nothing to the scale that Speaker Kotek got. So interesting race. I think people were basically expecting this, but I don't think they were expecting the margin.
Yeah, I would also say the endorsements thing seems a little asymmetrical, actually. I think it matters a lot on the Democratic side. I haven't seen it matter as much on the Republican side. There's a handful of groups, I think, that speak to a particular value set: Oregon Right to Life, sometimes Oregon Firearms Federation, although they've made some interesting choices that I think are limiting the impact of the value of their endorsements, like not endorsing any incumbents in this last election, which is fascinating. And then, so Oregon Right to Life is a big one, obviously. Disclaimer: I used to work at Oregon Right to Life. And then also sometimes like a gun group, sometimes the NRA, or if they come out strongly against a particular person, and then Timber Unity. But beyond that, I think that there aren't a huge number of groups or people in Oregon that can just make an endorsement that flips a ton of voters. I think that in Oregon, it is a lot more, for Republicans, it's a lot more about, like, where you stand on the issues, how do you speak to the issues. Not that that isn't important for Democrats, but I just think like the endorsements don't matter as much is what I'm trying to say for Republicans. I haven't noticed that.
Well, let's move then to the Republicans. So Christine Drazan, former House Minority Leader, is going to be the GOP nominee almost certainly. She'll probably actually be bolstered by the Clackamas County returns as they get counted.
Because that's her home county. So I think I would say that's true.
But I think she ends up with less than 30% of the vote. Is that right, Reagan?
Yeah, she's at 22% now, and I think she'll end up between 22 and 25%.
This is the second time I've mentioned this before. John Horvick is the best Oregon politics Twitter account. You should all be following him. It's at Horvick.
Absolutely.
But he tweeted a chart of the total votes for Oregon Republican gubernatorial primary winners. So basically, how many votes that each winner of the GOP primary has won in a governor's race dating back to 1938. And Christine Drazan has the lowest total number since 1938. Which is
the next lowest is 30 something with Kevin Mannix in a 3-way race. That was a pretty significant 3-way race. It was Rob Saxton and someone else. I can't remember who the other one was.
Mannix got 117,000. Saxton got 125,000.
That's right.
Drazan's at 65,000. Really, there's no one under 100,000 votes until you go all the way back to Earl Snell in 1946. So I bring that up because it's kind of interesting. I don't think that actually matters. Like we talked about this when we had you on last. I still think the Republicans all unite behind Christine Drazan. I don't think there's really a risk of like splintering. I will say I was doing the math on like the candidates that I would consider more of the sort of MAGA lane, like sort of Trump aligned. Carrie McQuiston, Mark Thielman, Stan Pulliam, Bridget Barden. They together earn more than Christine Drazan. But the non-MAGA, more like traditional Republican, Christine Drazan, Bob Tiernan, Bud Pierce, Jessica Gomez, I think that it's about 50-50 on each side of it. So interesting split, but you're the GOP expert. What do you make of the primary?
Yeah, I would say there's definitely that Trump has an impact here, but it's been less pronounced just because he hasn't been active here. He's only ever held one rally, and it was in 2016 early on, I think in Eugene maybe. And so, I just think he hasn't been active here. Some of the effects of his politics and the stuff he talks about does trickle down, but like you said, for the most part, I think it's kind of a pretty divided, and it's race dependent too. You look at Georgia, where Brian Kemp, the incumbent governor, has been under attack relentlessly for like 2 years from Donald Trump because of his unwillingness to get involved in the election stuff there. And he's pulling way ahead of David Perdue, who's out of money and has pulled all of their TV ads. Like he's probably going to win 60-30 now.
But counterpoint, McCrory and Ted Budd in North Carolina, that was insane.
Yeah, I think I was kind of already. I mean, McCrory been behind the whole time. I think the problem was more he was in the has-been category a little bit. He wasn't like, I think if it was incumbent U.S. Senator Thom Tillis versus Ted Budd, it would have been a closer race. Budd may still have won, but like McCrory had been out of politics for a little while, and I think had been always perceived as pretty establishment. But that might just be me.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I did. Bill Post asked me on Tuesday morning to do my prediction of top 5 and percentages, and this is a real tweet that you can check. It's timestamped at 10:14 p.m. on Monday.
How'd you do?
And I guessed Drazan 25%,
and she's right now at 23%. So very good.
Yeah, Tiernan at 16%.
He's at 18%.
I had Pulliam at 15, which was a little high.
He's at 10.
But I did have him in third place.
Yeah.
Pierce at 10% and McQuiston at 7%.
Pierce is at 9 and McQuiston is at 9. Yeah, that was very, very, very good.
And I think what tells you is not that I'm brilliant, but that the Nelson Report polling that was done was accurate. It was a good read of the environment. It was the trend lines followed, because that's all I did. I took the trend lines from the 2 polls and extrapolated them. So the polling was really good in this particular race. And Nelson hasn't done a ton of public polls, but I give him a lot of credit for being really good on this one, and hope they do some more of it, because we need more public polling on the Republican and Democratic sides in Oregon, because it's just very not active. You just have no idea how these big races are going. So I think you also kind of see the money mattering a lot in this race, because Tiernan spent, and he was willing to commit to TV buys and big TV buys. Drazan also committed to big TV buys. I think Pulliam ended at 150, 200K in TV, which was not a lot compared to Drazan buying $1 million and Tiernan buying 800K, but also didn't buy more than a couple 100K in TV when his opponents were buying close to $1 million, right? And it's like,
it's so funny that
matters.
There've been, for the last like 10 years, it feels like there have been people saying like TV is going to start mattering way less. Like people are streaming, people are fast forwarding through the commercials. Sure seems like TV still is a powerful communication tool, at least on the Republican side, but probably for all voters.
And I think for all voters, I think if you're not on TV in a competitive race where your opponent is, you're going to get blown out of the water. And that's just the truth. Like, once you make it competitive, then it's about issues. Then it's about other endorsements. Then it's about other things. But if you can't compete on TV when your opponent is, you are at risk of losing your election. In small races, I think you can get away with not being on TV or beating your opponent when he's not on TV. But you have to know everybody in your community and make sure they're voting for you and all that stuff. And this is just a big race. And there wasn't a ton of mail either. I only got 3 mailers from the governor's race, and they're all from Bridget Barton, and sometimes you just don't end up on a particular person's list. I know Drazan sent some pieces. I know Tiernan sent some pieces, but there really wasn't a big mail fight. The mail fights happened in the congressional races, but this fight was on TV for the most part.
So before we wrap up the governor's race, important to note that there will be another woman governor of Oregon after Kate Brown. Yep. It's either going to be Betsy Johnson, Christine Drazan, or Tina Kotek. I think worth noting that there have been widely reported in the press strained relationships among those three. And
I'm shocked by that development.
They're basically all already preemptively going negative against each other. Like very immediately, like on election night, we're all like trying to frame their opponents.
I got Betsy Johnson's email that night, and it was attacking Christine Drazan for being pro-life and attacking Tina Kotek as part of the Kate Brown 2.0 establishment. And so this is what will be fascinating, is you will hear Tina Kotek and Betsy Johnson say the pretty similar stuff about Drazan, and you'll see Drazan and Kotek say pretty similar stuff about Johnson, and you'll see Drazan and Johnson say pretty similar stuff about Kotek. And so I think it'll be super fascinating to see where do they actually diverge? Where are they going to try to make that contrast besides their individual lanes? Is there going to be policy differences, or is it just going to be they're all going to set up their own camps and try to make their camp the biggest?
My pushback is I actually think the way Kotek and Drazan talk about Johnson is going to sound very different. And
because they're trying. Yeah, I'm sorry. Maybe I didn't make that clear, but yes, I agree with you on that, because they're going to be trying to make Johnson eat up their opponent's base.
Exactly. And so that's what's interesting is, like, in a traditional race, there's a bit, you're trying to win over 50% of the vote head to head. So there's this, like, you want to bring down your opponent to some extent, but really you want to boost up your own, you want people to vote for you. In this race, like literally the most important factor will, assuming Betsy Johnson doesn't win, which is an assumption that might not be true. She could win. At least that's what I believe. The most important factor will be, does Betsy Johnson pull more votes from the Republican side or the Democratic side? And that sort of necessitates significant spending by either and or, by Kotek and or Drazan to incentivize the electorate to seat Betsy Johnson as one way or the other. So all that to say, I'm anticipating this is going to be a very, very negative, lots of attack ad election. That's what I'm guessing.
Oh yeah, you can bet on that. I will take the opposite kind of spot. I have a piece coming out soon, probably next month, that will basically say I don't believe Johnson has a chance at winning. And it's not because I think that Drazan's a lock to win. Obviously, this is a tough race for Republicans. And I don't know that Johnson hurts her a bunch, but I don't know it helps her either. It's kind of a mixed bag. But I don't think that the political environment is ripe for independents and people who don't have a party base behind them to win. I think it's just difficult. and it's already so rare, and it became more rare in the last 10 years of partisan divide, as that partisan divide has gotten tougher to bridge. And so I think there's a handful of people in the state that are donating a lot of money to Betsy Johnson that love her, and I think that her district loves her, and I don't think anyone else in the state has that strong affinity for her. And I think that the party is the reason that you can overcome that, because even if people in every other county that isn't Multnomah don't know Tina Kotek, they identify the affinity for her by her being their party's nominee. Same thing with Drazan on the other side. Betsy Johnson doesn't have a party, and so it's really difficult, so much harder for her to build that affinity. And in an environment where we think that Drazan will be pretty well funded, we think that Kotek will be pretty well funded, even if Betsy Johnson has twice the amount of money. I don't think that money buys that affinity. I think people buy that affinity. So we'll see.
Yeah.
But I take the opinion that I don't think that she can run.
Well, we will certainly be talking a lot about this over the next few months before Election Day. Transitioning to Congress, the context. So we'll talk about the primary outcomes. The context that I think you are the one who got me onto Punch Bowl. Punch Bowl came out with data. I think it was internal polling from the Democrats actually that says in a swing district where you would anticipate about a 50-50 split among Democrats and Republicans. Republicans are polling 8 points ahead of a generic Democrat in these tough districts.
And that's via DCCC polling. So Democrats did polling that said Republicans are ahead.
So if you apply that margin, I think CD 4, 5, and 6 are all considered in play if it's an 8-point swing. Do I think it'll be an 8-point swing in Oregon? I do not. But by the national standard of that poll, these are all competitive national races. Okay.
So my take on the red wave real fast is it's earned in Oregon. In other states where you have races that accidentally go Republican, I don't think you see that as much in Oregon because of our system of the vote by mail, of the time people have to make up their minds. You're not walking into a polling station angry and punching the Republican part of the ballot, right? You have some time to think about it. Maybe you are angry and you still vote that way, but it lessens the impact a little bit of that maybe emotional response. But I think it's earned. So if you run a good campaign on the issues that matter to people, you'll pick up some points on the wave. But just like in 2010, where there were places that were going hard Republican, even in Midwestern states that have traditional polling stations, Oregon still split 30-30 in the House, almost 15-15 in the Senate, and a very close governor's race. So that's my take on what the red wave will do in Oregon. So if all those congressional campaigns, the Republicans run good races, they'll get a bump from the red wave, but they'll still have to run really excellent races in order to win.
So, and to the point of who the candidates will be, Val Hoyle, decisive victory. I think last time I looked, wasn't it like 65% of the vote? Which, like, I think we predicted on this podcast that she was going to win. But I would not have put it at 65. Yeah, she is at 65%. The next closest is Doyle Canning at 15%. And then after that, you've got Sammy at 7%. You've got, and then John Selker at 5%, and then Andrew Kalloch at less than 5%. So really a very powerful showing for Val. She, of course, heads up against Alek Skarlatos. I know this is not a scientific way to compare it or to anticipate outcomes, but about 76,000 Democrats voted in CD4 primary, and about 45,000 Republicans voted in the CD4 primary.
Yeah, very tempting to look at those numbers and say it's going to be a blowout, but I wouldn't expect a blowout.
Yeah,
I think that the Democrats were energized. Alek had no primary. He's working on building his fundraising list, but didn't run like a get as many votes as you can in the primary kind of race. And it's hard to do without an opponent. It's not possible. And I did a study on this a couple of years ago, and all that is a sign of who ran a really good primary race, right? And a good example is my dad ran in his last election and won by 1.5 points, and he was behind in that vote comparison in the primary sides with 2 uncontested primaries by like 3,500 votes. So run a good campaign and you can totally flip that number. Big number to flip, and Alek knows that, and I know that's why he was frustrated about the way the maps were drawn, because it really did disadvantage him. But I mean, election night, Kevin McCarthy, Steve Scalise were all tweeting congratulations to Alek, and wanting him to win. And so I think they back him. I think that if DC comes in and buys TV time, I think if Alek really hits the doors, and Hoyle, who won't get caught flat-footed, she's a tough customer. Her last race against Avakian and Devlin in the Secretary of State primary was a just brutal and almost three-way exact split. Avakian only won that by 4 points. I'm looking at the totals there: 168,000 to 145,000 votes. That's a close race. So she is no slouch. And so it's really just about how big is the red wave in Oregon, right? And how good of a campaign does Alek win?
And here's the other thing I've been thinking about. So Democrats, so at the beginning of this cycle, everyone was like, oh my God, the maps are going to be so bad for Democrats, Republicans voted out. And then there was this wave of like, oh my God, the maps turned out, and I'm talking about redistricting across the country.
Yes.
Then everyone was like, oh my gosh, the Democrats did so well. Well, the last few months have actually been devastating for Democrats, capped by the new New York congressional maps, which take away several Democratic seats. So the other thing that's worth wondering.
I'm sorry, you mean keep several Republican seats that Democrats tried to eliminate? Sorry.
You say tomato. Okay. So, but why that matters is if you're Kevin McCarthy and Steve Scalise, all you care about is getting into the majority. And you have a finite number of resources that you can deploy across the country in races that you think give you the best chance of doing it. If Val is polling really strongly in CD4, and there's new seats that are on the map in New York and Florida and whatever, and California, where they think they have a better shot of picking them up. This has happened many times. It's happened at the state legislative level where leadership endorses a candidate, makes them all kinds of promises of the resources that'll be there for them. But then when the polling comes back and the map sort of solidifies, leadership is not there to turn out the money that they need to win. So I'm not saying that's what will happen to Alek, but I think Skarlatos has the steepest margin to overcome of the 3 Oregon congressional districts. CD5 and 6 are both more competitive. So it will be interesting to see like the extent to which the national donors and PACs actually do play in CD4.
Yeah, I mean, his job is to make it close in August and September polling. That's his job right now. And if he can do that, I think resources will be there. And if he can't, I don't think the resources will show up. And I think that's right.
So a place where resources are almost certainly to show up on both sides is CD5. You've got Lori Chavez-DeRemer, who again, overperformance. I think she did better than, it was not very close. It was, she's at 42%, Jimmy Crumpacker's at 30%. And then, a few candidates actually split the remaining votes. So, I mean, low voter turn, I guess we still don't have Clackamas numbers. So I actually won't even mention the total number of votes cast because I don't think that's helpful.
Yeah. I mean, I think Clackamas will add another 20 to 25,000, maybe more to that. It seemed like they were kind of in the 60 to 50,000 range. And so if you kind of factor in maybe a third of those are Republican ballots, maybe a little more. But,
so that's Lori over Jimmy. Jamie is currently winning 60-40 over Kurt. Like you said, everyone thinks it's going to shrink. I think Dave Wasserman said it won't be enough at this current rate, although I don't know. I don't know what Sherry Hall is doing, and I have no ability to know whether it's predictive or not. But we talked about the vote totals at for CD4. In this race, it's 42,000 Republican, 45,000 Democrat. So a lot closer. I think this is literally one of the closest in the country.
I mean, I think that they said it's a Biden +5 seat, but Biden overperformed in Oregon compared to Trump. Trump didn't do very well here. So I don't think that that's a good metric. This seat has gone Republican in competitive governor's races before. Like, I think I was talking to a couple of the candidates in this race, and they both got data from the NRCC once this map was confirmed. And they're like, yeah, this one went red in the new Bueller Kate Brown election. So like, it's very swingy territory. And I think you have kind of two competing theories, and we talked about those last time, which is McLeod-Skinner is a better Democrat and therefore has a better chance to hold the district because not all Democrats would show up for Schrader. But on the other hand, Schrader has survived a previous wave. So we'll get to test that theory with Jamie. Can Jamie sustain the kind of numbers that Schrader ran in this district, which
And-
have been pretty good against Republicans.
And can Jamie attract the kind of national money that Kurt was able to raise? Kurt was Congressman Schrader, very prolific fundraiser, as we mentioned. He was like the best congressional fundraiser in Oregon. I don't know if Jamie's taken certain pledges about PACs or corporate money or whatever, which was frankly a lot of money that I think Congressman Schrader was raising. Lori Chavez-DeRemer, I think, will have no problem raising a lot of money at the national level.
I agree with that. And I think that Jamie's progressive lane precludes her from getting certain money, but just like any other progressive running in any other district would, not all those corporate, swingy kind of groups would come and back a traditional progressive anyway. So I don't think that's necessarily her fault, but can she get the progressive groups to come and have her back? Can she get the type of local donations that she needs, right? And you have this situation where I can't remember if this is right. I better go check this real quick, but I retweeted somebody earlier, and I think it was a journalist who said that the residency inside these districts is either very close or doesn't exist for any of these candidates in 5 and 6, with Salinas living outside her district, Erickson living outside the district, and
I think Lori's outside
McLeod-Skinner and Lori Chavez-DeRemer, according to Chris Lehman at Capital Currents on Twitter. All 4 of these candidates live outside of their districts. So I think that presents it's part of this issue with the new maps, obviously. But also is going to present a challenge because nobody knows these folks, or at least not enough people know them yet. And so raising money is going to matter in congressional races for sure.
So the final congressional race, the one that probably got the most attention, was CD6. As we mentioned, Andrea Salinas wins handily. Also, Mike Erickson wins handily. So Salinas is at 37%. The next closest is Carrick Flynn at 19%. Then Cody Reynolds at 12%. Loretta Smith overperformed what I thought she would do. She got about 10%. Kathleen Harder underperformed a little bit what I thought. She's at 8%. Matt West underperformed what I thought at 8%. And TL was at about 6%. So a lot of vote split, but clearly Salinas, the leader. And then on the Republican side, Mike Erickson at 35%. He really kind of crushed the competition. Ron Noble at about 18.5%. Amy Ryan Corser at 15%. Angela Plowhead at 13%, and Jim Bunn at 11%.
So if you go on Open Secrets, this is a great site. And I had been here before, but I didn't realize this is how they broke out the data. So they have the district and amount raised, split up by congressional district, and then right below that they have external independent expenditures that happen independent of the candidates and who they supported and who they opposed, because all that data has to be filed with the Election Commission. So if you're looking at total raised by individual candidates, Cody Reynolds raised the most money, but as you said, he didn't even come close to second in that one. He raised 2.7. A lot of that's loans, like a 2 million of that was loans, spent most of it, right? Matt West loaned himself some money, had raised $1 million total, spent almost $1 million. And Carrick Flynn raised $1 million, spent right now it says this has got to be $334,000. So I'm hoping that he emptied his bank accounts. Otherwise, that's not going to look great.
Although that would be
Erickson raising,
that'd be interesting,
and loan close to $750,000 and spending most of that. Yeah.
Sorry for I was just gonna say that would be interesting if there was some strategy of like, well, I don't need to spend my money because the super PAC is helping me win the primary. Then I'll bring this to the general. But anyway, okay. So on the Republican side, Mike Erickson, clear winner. 35%. Ron Noble, who a lot of people thought would have been a really strong general election candidate, at about 19%. Amy Ryan Corser at 15%. Angela Plowhead 13%, and Jim Bunn down at 11%. Reagan, you may agree, you may disagree. My take is Salinas is a strong general election candidate, and Erickson is a weak general election candidate, or at least weaker than the alternative of Ron Noble. There's, of course, the controversy we're just reading here. It was Kevin Mannix, who is now the Republican nominee for the state legislature down in Kaiser, who attacked Mike Erickson in 2008 when he ran for Congress for dropping his girlfriend off at an abortion clinic and giving her money. Mike Erickson, of course, disputes that version of events. But what do you make of that matchup between Salinas and Erickson in the general?
Yeah, I think it's always, if you're recruiting in a race, you would want someone with tested elected experience, and Erickson doesn't have that, right? He's run in races, hasn't won one yet, hasn't been an elected official that I know of. Maybe he served in local capacity, but he has a business background, right? That's pretty popular among Republicans. So I think, depending on what happens again with that kind of the old opposition research, does it come back up again? Does another group try to attack him on it? Does Salinas attack him on it? Don't know. We'll just have to kind of watch that play off. But I agree. Erickson's biggest obvious advantage is the fundraising he raised and gave himself a good chunk of money, $722,000 total between his loans and his contributions. And next closest was actually Army veteran Nate Sandvig at $250,000, and then Ron Noble $130,000. And so I think that it's crazy. And here is my hot take on the Mike Erickson race here. Okay. So Erickson has this liability out there among Republicans. And I don't know if this was a question of staff resources or what. Mike Erickson doesn't have a Facebook page. And that is unheard of. But he won the primary. And I think in a situation where you either don't have the resources for it, or you're focused on other things, or you're worried about the potential liability of opposition research against you, you can get away with not having a Facebook page in a primary if you're outspending your opponents, and especially if you're doing so on TV and in the mail. I talked to people in that district who are Republicans who got Mike Erickson mail, multiple mailers, like every day for like 2 weeks.
He also mailed out of his district, and he mailed to households where there were no Republicans. So I have no idea what the mail consultant was doing in that race, but that is verified that both of those things happened.
Hey man, when you got to do what you got to do in order to win these races, right? Yeah, that's obviously tough, but hopefully he sorts that out for the general election. And he spent it all. His cash on hand is pretty low, under $100,000, and I'm sure he spent some of that in the final days of the election, and it hasn't been fully reported yet. So, I think this is a race to watch. Just like Alek, Mike Erickson has to prove in the late summer and early fall that this is competitive. And if he does, the money will show up. And I think that Erickson, you'll kind of find him surprisingly well connected based on people I've talked to. He's got good relationships. He just hasn't been in the limelight. And so can he leverage those to get what he needs out of DC? I think that's always the question. Everyone says they've got DC connections, but it's rare for those connections to be good connections. And so we'll see if that works out for him.
So in the last section of the podcast, we're gonna go quickly between Portland Metro races, legislative races, but we're going to start with the last statewide race. Actually, two quick statewide hits. One, Darlene Ortega handily defeats Vance Day for a position on the Court of Appeals. Not even close. Vance Day proclaimed that he was going to win on the Rational Republican podcast. He did not. He lost badly, which frankly, I don't think people were surprised. She was an incumbent, longtime incumbent, had incumbent next to her name on the ballot. So
that's tough to overcome. That's rough to overcome. If Republicans wanted to make a dent on the judiciary, it's either got to be through Republican appointments on those open seats, or it's got to be through removing that incumbency tag in order to kind of make those more competitive. Because I think it's different with politicians, where in some of these races, people picked outsiders and picked against the establishment. Not very many. As you kind of pointed out, this wasn't that much of an anti-establishment election, but there was a few cases where it was. But especially in judges' races, you really don't want an inexperienced judge, and most people don't know what to look for in a judge. So they tend to assume that unless a judge has done something wrong or created controversy like Vance Day did, and I think that probably hurt him a little bit. Obviously, he'll say that he was the target of partisan attacks. But I think that's just the way that race went, and I think that the incumbency tag made a big difference there too.
Okay, so BOLI, another nonpartisan race,
which is where Val Hoyle's leaving. That's why this is open.
So I thought Christina Stevenson was going to come in first place, and I thought Sherry Helt was going to come in second place. But I did not expect Christina Stevenson to be she is currently at 47% of the vote. At one point during early returns, she was over 50% of the vote. Sherry Helt is less than 20% of the vote right now. Casey Kula is at 14%. Brent Barker at 11% of the vote, overperforming expectations. So yeah, I mean, frankly, if like there's some Twitter back and forth on this about Casey Kula's participation in the race and some people defending him. And I saw some people with takes that, or heard some people with takes that if Casey wasn't in the race, Christina would have would have won outright. Of course, she got less than 50%. So it's going to go to the general election, which of course means, I don't know, Reagan, how much do you think gets spent on this race over the next 6 months? 500,000, 600, maybe more?
Yeah, I would say less than $1 million. So I know a couple of people who are union members who got one piece of mail on the BOLI race, and it was just a letter from their union saying, vote Christina Stephenson for Bureau of Labor and Industries. She will protect workers. As far as I know, that was really the only major piece of communications. I mean, I know she did some stuff, but none of these candidates were able to raise anything to do statewide mail, TV, anything, right? And so I think that had a huge impact. And then just the individual network to these people. Sherry Helt's a former state representative, so she's got a stronger network than even Casey Kula, who is a local elected official, right? And so I think that pretty much explains these results. I kind of think that Brent T. Barker, people confused him for the former state representative, Brent Barker, who he is not.
Jeff Barker? Or Brent Barton?
Brent Barton. Oh gosh, I can't believe I just did that. My apologies to Jeff Barker and Brent Barton. Maybe voters did what I did and said, "Hey, it's a mashup of my two favorite state legislators." Gosh, I feel so bad. But anyway, yes. So I think that their networks basically explain this, and I agree. I think if Casey wasn't in this race, Stephenson might have won outright.
She almost certainly would have won outright. Like he had mostly Democratic or left of center endorsements. People like Ted Kulongoski.
I would say I saw a ton of people, and that's because I follow Casey Kula. So hi Casey. I saw a ton of him retweeting all of these people on Twitter saying I'm voting for Casey Kula. I think that 15% of voters is the very online segment of hashtag Oracle voters who are just like so interested in Casey because he was the most active Twitter candidate running for BOLI.
And he won Yamhill County.
Yes, he won his home county, which that's not always a guarantee in these races.
But wasn't it you who noticed that in his seat, which he's Democrat, him leaving his seat, it's now 2 Republicans heading to the runoff on the Yamhill County?
Yeah, so a moderate Republican mayor and a Timber Unity backed business owner are going to face off in the general election. So rough times at the county commission level for Democrats in a lot of these seats, having trouble. By the way, the other place where anti-incumbency sentiment, we talked about Lane County earlier, we're talking about Yamhill, these open seats. The open seat in Lane County trending Republican also. That'll go to a runoff, but there were 3 Republicans, and the main Republican that did the most fundraising was ahead of the Democrat in the most conservative district in Lane County, and then also here in Yamhill. And then in Clackamas County, Ben West, who's a Wilsonville city councilor, got 47% of the vote. Sonia Fisher, the incumbent, got 33%.
I heard a rumor on election night that Sherry Hall, I don't know if this is true, so very big flag on this. I heard that the Clackamas County Elections Office was counting Republican ballots first.
Oh, wow.
I don't know if that, I had not seen that reported, but this was shared with me as something that wasn't like a secret or sketchy, but just like their order of counting was Republicans first, then Democrats. I don't know if that's true, but that's why I'm like, I'm taking all the Clackamas County stuff with a huge grain of salt.
That's probably best. That would be shocking to me if that was how they were handling it. But
super weird and not good. Yeah. But okay. Anyway, we are almost out of time, but we still have to talk about a couple of Portland Metro races and legislative races. So real quickly, I will say strong finish for Lynn Peterson, currently over 50%, although she is doing worse in Clackamas County than she is in Multnomah and Washington. So that may force a runoff when all votes are counted. We will have to see. Really strong finish for Joanne Hardesty. I think she's at 43 or 44% of the vote. Vadim Mazursky and Renee Gonzalez are like really close right now. Renee is ahead, so that will be a runoff in the general. And then Dan Ryan, a super decisive win. Wasn't even close. He's 60-something%. No runoff. He gets a full term on the council.
I think the reason for those results real quick is because everyone knows charter is going to be on the ballot, charter reform. No one was throwing out the incumbents trying to fix their city. They're they're more bought in on this charter reform and knowing that their system is broken, and so they're kind of focused on that more so. But could be wrong. That's just my take.
One other observation here, though, is like to varying degrees, but especially Lynn Peterson and Joanne Hardesty, and Jessica Vega Peterson, by the way, who's leading but headed to a runoff likely with Sharon Myron for the Multnomah County Chair's race. People for Portland they weren't attack ads, but they were basically trying to portray Portland leaders as, inept or not taking the actions necessary. No evidence that any of that money played an impact in these outcomes that I can see.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that, again, that just has to do with our system and making it difficult for the rage election to happen. Maybe that's a wrong take, but you kind of think about those early ballot measures that happened, the bill size more and the tax reform and all those kinds of ballot measures, and how we haven't had those recently. I think it's just the electorate here has gotten more used to seeing these things happen and really thinking them all the way through, and being, obviously the state tilts more Democratic too than it has in the past. So I think, that has had more of an impact also.
Okay, so the last section here, Reagan, is the legislative results.
Yep.
I know we both, there's like, I've written down like 15 races. We won't talk about all of them. High points, I will say, races in the Senate that people were watching. Rep. Daniel Bonham, huge win over Steve Bates, spent a ton of money. He spent like $250,000, raised and spent, but just, I think he's at 80% or something.
Got to correct what I said in the last podcast. I called him former state representative Daniel Bonham. He's current state representative. I meant soon to be former, as in I was pretty sure he was going to win this primary, and I'm pretty sure he's going to win his general election in this R+5 seat.
Oh, interesting. So Bonham in the Willamette Week interview said that it was an equal number of Democrats and Republicans, but I guess that doesn't mean performance. This
district will perform a little bit more conservative than that because it doesn't include a lot of urban area, even though like it's got a little bit of it, but it's not like that hardcore urban area. It's like ex-urban area, if that makes sense.
Okay, so Aaron Woods, candidate in Senate District 13, that's my area, Tigard, Sherwood, King City, and Wilsonville, defeats Chelsea King in what was probably the most closely watched Democratic primary.
And
Aaron
King
Woods
outspent Aaron Woods big. I was thinking that she was going to win this and was just shocked by these results.
Well, and keep an eye on Orstar for the final week, because I heard that there was some pretty significant giving to Aaron Woods in the final week. So we will see how that turns out. They each frankly had not an even split, but like fairly split on endorsements. I would say Chelsea probably had better individual endorsements, but Aaron probably had a slight edge on institutional endorsements. I think I got 5 mail pieces from Aaron and maybe 4 or 3, so pretty even on mail. But anyway, that was an interesting race. OBI, Oregon Business and Industries, who we talked about on this podcast, they endorsed Aaron Woods. Not very, but relatively uncommon for them to endorse in a Democratic primary. In part,
they almost exclusively deal in incumbent protection.
Yeah, and they picked Aaron, and I think invested $5 or $10K to support him. So, and then there was the Woodburn area seat where you had Anthony Rezilis, Mayor Swenson of Woodburn, and then Rich Walsh, who I didn't really fully understand the lanes of that race, but it looks like Swenson is going to win that primary.
Yeah, and he'll take on quasi-incumbent Kim Thatcher. So because the district lines move so much, she doesn't have her whole seat, but she has chunks of Salem and a little bit of Kaiser where she used to live. This is the number is the old Peter Courtney seat, and it includes a good chunk of his seat, but he's retiring. And the primary turnout number is very close on that one. So I'd expect this to be a good contest to watch.
So yeah, in terms of House races, the Neelam Gupta, Daniel Wen primary in Lake Oswego is unpredictable, but I heard that because there's so much Clackamas left and Clackamas is skewing towards Daniel right now, that he's likely to win. Brad Witt loses his re-election campaign. I'm using quotation marks for our podcast listeners, since he was running in a different district.
And Witt heavily outspent Tom Anderson, and Jackie Lewing, who is a city councilor, dropped out but couldn't get her name off the ballot. And both Anderson and Lewing are in the progressive lane. and Anderson spent $12,000 and still won that seat, despite Witt spending $100,000 and maybe more independent, I don't know, money getting spent for him. That I was shocked by that, because it was a huge disadvantage for Anderson for Jackie Long to be on the ballot, but still pulled it out. So pretty impressive on that one.
In terms of other races, there were not a ton that I was I don't think there's any that I was shocked by for any of the other primaries.
No.
They shook out about the way that we thought. There were some, like, in that HD12 race, Charlie Conrad wins, but all of the candidates were like within 10 or 15 points of each other.
Basically got a quarter of the vote each, honestly. Yeah. No one's under 20%, no one's over 35. Like, yeah, that'll be interesting to watch, because I'm pretty sure that's a heavy Republican advantage seat. So that is that's going to be Conrad's going to be in good shape there for the fall if he holds on, and I think that he will, because I think Lane was pretty quick on their ballot counting. House Rep 17 district, the Republican primary between Beth Jones and Ed Deal, 70-30.
You were correct.
That's a pretty big win. I had predicted that one, and I think that Ed goes on to an easy general election victory.
We don't have to play the prediction game, but I will say, so HD 21, RJ Navarro wins the Democratic primary, Kevin Mannix wins the Republican primary. My understanding is this is one of the closer registration districts. Yep. I think there's slight Democratic advantage, but it seems entirely plausible that Kevin Mannix could be a state representative yet again.
Yeah, I would give Mannix the advantage here. He has more of that institutional back support. Navarro's gotten the general Democratic backing, but he's always running in harder districts, once against Bill Post, and maybe one other seat for Kaiser City Council was if I remember correctly, which I may not be.
Kevin Mannix first elected to the Oregon House of Representatives in 1988.
As a Democrat. I will remind you, he changed parties partway through his public service.
Yes. So that'll be an interesting one to watch. Any other observations on the legislative level, Reagan?
Yes, I'm looking for House District 51. And this is one of those ones where I was told lawn signs don't vote, but if they could, James Heeb, the incumbent, who didn't have the traditional incumbent backing, looks like he would win. This is Clackamas, so again, we're taking all those results with a grain of salt, but the early ballots show him ahead 60-40 against Lisa Davidson, the challenger, who did outraise him, not by a ton, but maybe 20 or 30 grand, and had more of that institutional lobbyist style response. So I don't know if that, what else was at play in this district. I didn't get a ton of that one, but James Heeb looks like he may hold on to his seat despite having been appointed just before the short session started. So pretty interesting result there.
So 2022 general election across the board. I think here's a high takeaway to close, and then Reagan, I'll hand to you for the last word. There's gonna be a ton of competitive races, a ton of money spent. Races that normally wouldn't be competitive are going to be super competitive. I spoke to some people, they're actually progressives, who are anticipating that the Senate, your father's PAC, might swoop in and defeat. I think they just need 3 pickups for it to be split.
Yeah, I think that's right. So, and I always miscount this because Boquist is an independent, but basically votes with Republicans. And if they get to, and here's the thing, I don't know. I haven't talked with Boquist. I haven't talked to anyone clearly. This is just speculation. My assumption is if Republicans plus Boquist equals 16 seats, they have the votes to organize the leadership and they won't have split. I would assume that's what happens. If they win 14, my assumption is Boquist votes with Republicans and they share power with co-Senate presidents because that has been the most tested and effective way to split power. You've had in other states where the Senate president has been the member, they've been sharing, or has been one member that's defected from his party, but I don't think that will be the case here.
Well, remember in Oregon, when there was a split I think it was in the 90s, Peter Courtney was the consensus candidate. He was a moderate Democrat who was elevated. Yes. I think that's how he first became Senate president.
I think that's right.
Split Senate. Mm-hmm. So
because we didn't have a split Senate in 2010, but we did in the 90s. That's right.
Yes. So that
and I think there's a lot of Republicans from that era who would tell you they should have gone co-Senate presidents and they didn't. because turns out Peter Courtney didn't leave for almost 3 decades. So maybe that didn't work to their advantage. But you're right. Yes, he came to power at that consensus split, but they didn't split committees the exact same way either. So I think the 2010 model more likely to be employed if that Senate splits close like that. But if Republicans take control, I mean, you'll see pretty big change. I don't know that anyone's necessarily expecting the House to flip, but there's enough seats on the table that it could in a good year for Republicans, or if a couple Dems get caught flat-footed. So we'll really see how organized can Republicans get. And when OPB talked to me about the governor's race and what can happen, and is there really a chance for governor's race, what I'm looking for basically is, are Republicans coalescing? Are we continuing the internal fights, or are we all getting behind, circling the wagons, focusing on the issues that matter not just to Republicans but to moderate voters? And if that happens and the resources are there, could be a great year, one of the best in our history. But if we don't, you could see Democrats continue that the control that they've exerted for a while at the legislative level, and especially at the statewide level. So it'll be interesting to watch.
My message to Republicans would be, don't listen to Reagan. Feel free to write in people, vote for the Constitution Party nominee, express your support for who you want, and don't let the party machine tell you to vote for.
And to the voters in Ben's district, I would say that Ben's a nice guy, but you never know what he's going to do in the legislature. So just be careful and make sure to write him as many emails as humanly possible, because he committed to me that he's going to read every single one of them, even the spam. So sign him up for all kinds of lists.
Thank you for that plug. So with that, this was a very long episode, but I think we did a pretty comprehensive review of what happened and why it matters. A thank you to everyone who is subscribed to our YouTube channel. We'll probably have a celebration when Alex gets back, because he's been pushing the YouTube subscribers. But we've officially reached the threshold where we now get to have our own YouTube URL specific to our name. So Buddy and Alex are very happy about that. So thank you for the support. And yeah, Reagan, if anyone wants to follow along with your thoughts, what's the best way for them to be in touch?
You can find my newsletter, my website, and really everything on my Twitter account at Reagan Knopp, or reaganknopp.net. You got links. They're all interlinked because those are the places I spend the most time. Been trying to write more newsletters and send out stuff. And then lately it's just been self-promoting my appearances on this podcast because Alex has been gone so much. So hopefully Alex comes back to you guys here tanned, rested, and ready to talk about the Biden's border wars.
All right, everybody, that's it for today's episode. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next week.